Hey guys, we're looking at chapter 2 in our comparative government class, and so here's what we want to look at. Max Weber defines the state as an organization that has a monopoly on violence. Okay, pretty dark definition, but obviously we're looking at power, and if political science is the study of power, a good place for us to start is the study of the state. Relating to that element, states possess sovereignty. Sovereignty, at least in theory, which allows them to act with limited constraints. Okay, there are many organizations in societies. We've got religions, we've got commercial ones, we've got voluntary ones, sports clubs would be organizations. Okay, so we all know all these different organizations, but we generally think of states as having the right to do some things that to compel people to do things, okay? So like a state can compel you to pay your taxes. A state can imprison you, okay? This would fall under sovereignty. Churches and softball teams generally don't have those rights, right? Okay? Most people would think of a softball team would be doing something wrong if it jailed somebody, right? Okay, so we generally accept that it's okay for states to do such things. So states are comprised of institutions. Okay, we talked last chapter about institutions. Institutions are going to help organize power and people. So in chapter 1, we covered the term institutions, but it may be good to review that institutions are not just a collection of people or rules. Rather, institutions are regularly occurring patterns of how people organize themselves and how these patterns take on lives of their own. So we talked about formal and informal organizations. If you need institutions, if you need a refresher on those, go back and check out chapter 1 on institutions. It's going to be important as we look at states in this chapter. So as we break down Weber's definition, the authority of the state is centered in the government, the people who run the state. That's what we're going to look at as the government, the people who run the state. We're going to talk about 3 very, very different concepts that oftentimes people are going to mix up. Okay? And so the first one is government. That's going to be the people who run the state. And the government is shaped by the state's regimes. Regimes may be classified as democracies or non-democracies, okay? Or they can be more specific type of government, such as personalistic dictatorships, monarchies, military regimes. We can break things down. But if we want to think simple, and that's probably our best course of action right now, is we can think of it as democracies or non-democracies. So regime types are going to be discussed in more detail in later chapters, but for now we want to know the difference between a government and a regime. A government is who runs the state, the people, which people are in charge. So in the United States, our government would be Trump and our congressmen and our Supreme Court justices, etc. Our regime, however, would be a democracy. Okay, so regimes are more basic than governments. They are very seldomly changed. Okay, in democracies, governments can change very frequently. Every single election, there can be a change in government, right? Because we're changing the people. But the democratic regime would take a catastrophic event. Something big is going to happen in order to change us into a non-democracy, right? And so that is a bigger step, and so a regime is much more difficult to change. Regimes also have long-term goals regarding individual freedoms and equality. Okay, we talked about freedom and equality in the last chapter. Again, if you need a refresher, check out chapter 1. It's going to be important as we move forward, that conflict between freedom and equality. So regimes are going to shape where power should reside and the use of that power. Okay, so before we go any further, let's make sure we know the difference between a state, a regime, and a government. Okay? And so the first step is a state. A state, like we said, is the monopoly of force over a given territory. A state is a set of political institutions that generate and carry out policy. It's typically highly institutionalized. It is sovereign. And it is characterized by such institutions as an army, a police force, taxation, a judiciary, and a social welfare system. Okay, so the state is going to be nearly impossible to change from inside. The state normally changes if there's a force from the outside, such as a warring nation. Okay, so for example, if Germany invades France and takes over a part of France, that has changed the state of France, right? Their state has changed and now they've become part of Germany. That would take a catastrophic event from the outside. A regime is also difficult to change, but regimes would change from the inside normally. A regime is norms and rules regarding individual freedoms and collective equality, the locus of power, and the use of that power. Okay, so we're kind of looking at the rules now of that state. Now the rules are difficult to change, but we can change them, right? In the United States, we have an amendment process to the Constitution, so we can change our regime types, right? We can change things, but we follow that process. Institutionalized regimes are institutionalized, but they can be changed by dramatic social events, such as a revolution. Okay, so if the people were to rise up and decide we want to back this person rather than the United States government, that can happen. Remember, John Locke says that the people can overturn their government if they don't like what they're doing. Okay, and so regimes can change, but it is more difficult and it's normally from within. Regimes are characterized at the most basic level as either democracy or authoritarian, and they often embody a constitution. We often don't think about that constitution when we think about authoritarian countries, but as we're going to see as we get to the case studies, most are going to have some kind of written law, some kind of rule book for their country, and that is the Constitution. And a lot of times that's what the regime is going to base its power on. Okay, so let's move on to government then. A government is the leadership or elite in charge of running the state. Okay, now different countries are going to figure this out in different ways, but in America we vote on different people. And so right now our government is comprised of Republican leadership with Donald Trump and Michael Pence, and then if we go into the Congress, we look at them there as well. It is weakly institutionalized. There are institutions, but it is not near as strong as in regimes and then in states as well. It is limited by the existing regime. We can't all of a sudden say we're going to have a supreme leader like Iran has in the United States, because it's not in our Constitution. It's not part of our regime. So the government is dictated by our regime. It is often comprised of elected officials, such as the president or congressman, a prime minister perhaps. And so that's kind of what the difference is going to be. The state, most difficult to change, usually takes an outside force. The regime, difficult to change, usually takes an inside force. Government changes all the time, elections, etc. So we've been talking about the differences between state, government, regime. There's also another set of terms that people will often mix up, and that is country and nation. Most people put them together as one. I do it myself. It is just kind of a part of our English language that they've kind of gotten meshed together. But political scientists do make a differentiation between a country and a nation. A country is going to be a state, government, regime, and the people who live within that political system. So in order to be a country, we've got to have that state as well, okay? A nation is a group of people who are bound together by a common set of political aspirations. We'll be looking more at nations in chapter 3, but just as an example, Palestine is a nation. Okay, the nation of Palestine, we've heard that before. That is a group of people who want the same thing. They are politically motivated, but they do not have a state. They do not have a state. They did, and then we carve out Israel, and we look at back in the 1940s for that kind of information. For what, if you're looking for more information on that. But Palestine, they are an institution. They do have a regime. They do have people who are in charge. They do have a nation, but they are not a country because they are missing that state aspect. Okay, so the country has to have the state, the regime, the government, and the people within, where the nation is missing parts of that as we go forward. Okay, so there are two paths of political organizations: consensus and coercion. Okay, and we've all heard those terms before, but let's break down the path of political organizations by consensus or coercion. The consensus path is individuals band together to protect themselves and create common rules. Leadership is chosen from among the people. Security is achieved through cooperation, and we wind up with a democratic regime. You can hear the puppy. He likes the democratic regime. Okay? The coercion path, however, has individuals brought together by a ruler, okay, who imposes authority and monopolizes the power. So we can start to see the difference already. Security is achieved through domination, and this is an authoritarian regime. So a consensus path is going to lead us towards a democratic regime. A coercion path is going to lead us towards an authoritarian regime. Okay? Now, either one of them can work, and neither one of them is technically good or bad. We can judge that afterwards. So we want to start looking at that right now. A lot of times people in this class are going to look at Iran and say, they're stupid, why would they set things up that way? China, we're stupid, why would you set things up that way? We have a bias towards our own government. They have their rationale, they have their reasons. Now, how does it work? And that's something that we can evaluate. We can look at civil rights. We can look at the GDP of countries, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this country, the comparative parts. Okay, we don't want to just automatically start judging. It's different, therefore it's bad. Democratic regimes, consensus path. Authoritarian regimes, coercion path. Philosophers have long debated why people are motivated to make the shift from loose communities to more centralized forms of government. For philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, humans submitted to a strong authority to gain protection from violent anarchy. He said the social contract, and in his book Leviathan, lays out that the government is as powerful as it needs to be to keep the people down in order to protect the people. Okay, and so we're going to give up our rights in order to be protected, just for survival. In his famous work, Leviathan, Hobbes states that life before the state was nasty, brutish, and short. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? While less pessimistic about anarchy is John Locke. John Locke is a strong influence on the United States, right? I'm probably sure that you know that stuff, especially if you took AP US government already. While less pessimistic, John Locke is going to say kind of the same thing, that we have to enter into this social contract in order to be protected by the government. The social contract for Locke, though, says that leaders voluntarily are going to come forward to benefit the authority. In his Two Treatises of Government, Locke argues that governments help protect such fundamental rights as property ownership, life, liberty, the ability to kind of be free and go out and about. The government is supposed to protect those things. And so we look at those two individuals especially, and they contrast quite a bit, but they still say that government is there to protect the people, okay? And that is why people have moved out of kind of this nasty, brutish anarchy into these communities of government. In contrast, a third social contract theorist, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, believes that the state of nature was egalitarian, but that societal development led to the division of labor and private property, creating systemic inequality. This economic inequality led to political inequity, as rules were initially created by the elite to preserve their status. So he's going to say that when we look at our governments today, that the United States and other countries were set up by the elite, that the masses did not have the power, and that we are kind of subject to those even to this day. So it's good to look at Hobbes, it's good to look at Locke, it's good to look at Rousseau, but it's also good to look at evidence. And archaeological evidence shows that people developed complex societies at the same time that they developed language, and that the power and authority were present long before anyone made a social contract or a castle. Okay? There was never a state of nature, is what archaeological evidence is pointing to. Politics is an element of human nature, not a deviation from it. We are not saying people are bad, people are a blank slate like Hobbes or Locke would say. We're saying people are meant to be in this relationship of politics, that is a part of our nature in order to do so. Community structures in other species, including just about all primates, exhibit hierarchies and coordination mechanisms that are sometimes highly structured. If we look at wolves, we look at the alpha and the beta, and we go on forward, and we see them being submissive to each other, and there's one alpha wolf. And so we look at this kind of political structure that even in the wolves are going to have, okay? And so we're saying that it is a part of our nature to set up a political system. A better question that we should ask then is, why do we live in a world of 190 or so states instead of a large empire or feudalism or 100,000 microstates? Okay? In many ways, political authority was an answer to the violence of pre-state societies. Clan and tribal groups fought, rivals for resources. All right? This is going to be a much better thing for us to look at for why the world developed the way that it did. As the most successful groups advanced, they needed to evolve more effective organizational forms to govern territories and people, create more effective defenses, support increasingly urbanized communities. As famous political sociologist Charles Tilly once wrote, war is what made the state. So not nature, war is what made the state, that we banded together in order to defend ourselves. Another good question is, why did the modern state emerge in Europe? Okay? The Middle East and China had advanced trade empires with strong centralized bureaucracies and similar patterns. Also emerged in Latin America and even in Africa. In contrast, after the fall of Rome, Europe entered a period of anarchy, during which the centralized empire was replaced by moving bands of marauders and rule by warlords. Sounds like a fun place to be, right? Okay. This fragmented, unstable, and violent environment generated a kind of rapid organizational evolution. Groups that could quickly adapt in response to new challenges survived, while less successful groups were conquered and disappeared. In addition, as argued by biologist Jared Diamond, Europe's geographic proximity to Asia and the Middle East gave it access to new plants, new animals, new technologies, and this included new ideas on how to govern. Finally, religious wars during the 1500s and 1600s would devastate the continent and break the Catholic Church's political control, permanently shifting toward local secular leaders. Many scholars date the birth of the modern state to 1648, and this is where we have the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War and established the idea that local rulers, not the church, would shape the religious authority of their territory. Now, the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia itself did not uniquely change politics, but it was emblematic of a larger transformation. In it, kings, technically princes, acknowledged each other's rights to make rules within specific territories, an organizing principle that people have reproduced throughout the period since. Okay? This set of rules is one that everyone has an incentive to follow. Sovereignty is not free license. Kings have an incentive to keep their own religious fanatics under control, since King A will hold King B responsible for it. For example, B's citizens cross into A's territories to burn heretics. The 2001 U.S. reprisal against the Taliban regime in Afghanistan is just one contemporary example where Afghanistan was not holding its citizens as responsible. Those citizens reached out. The United States reached in to make sure that they were responsible for what was going on in the world. While Europe was one of the most economically backward regions of the world in the 1500s, the development of the state would propel it into a growth rate that would outpace any other region of the world. See the discussion on pages 42 and 43 on the benefits of the state. Super important. Make sure that you underline those in your notes here. Pages 42 and 43 to discussion of the benefits of the state. All these factors allow states to collect resources and mobilize them on a larger scale, allowing them to project their power more effectively than any other form of political organization. Ultimately, this economic advantage would trigger Europe's imperialistic expansion, which in turn would spread the state to the rest of the world. So we can start to see that Europe did this, and then they branched out and kind of was like almost like a common cold that everybody caught. This expansion turns into spreading the state to the rest of the world instead of just this marauders and nomads going around and conquering people. So we can't talk about states without legitimacy. When rulers are seen as legitimate by their publics, they gain power and authority. People obey laws that they see as legitimate, even when the threat of punishment is very slight. Legitimacy, therefore, creates power based on consent, not coercion. Again, legitimacy creates power based on consent, not coercion. In the absence of consent, governments have to rely more on the other mechanisms, which is fear or rewards, which can be very costly and very risky. People are more apt to break the law if they do not think it is legitimate. Okay? If it's legitimate, people are more apt to follow the law, even if it's just a small little fine. If it's a $10 fine, people are like, but we should be doing that. Okay? It's legitimate. If it is not legitimate, if they think their rights are being imposed, then even if the penalty is very, very harsh, they still might break that law, okay? And we look at the civil rights movement for this in the 1950s and 60s. We look at the Woolworth counter. We look at the riding of the buses. We can look to those as examples. People thought that those laws were illegitimate, and they crossed them with great consequences to many of them. So there's three types of political legitimacy, and the first one is traditional legitimacy. And we see this in the British monarchy and Queen Elizabeth II, to the extent that people identify the traditional monarch as a distinctive expression of their culture. The Queen has some leeway. However, in the United Kingdom, the monarch has few remaining powers. Alternately, the Saudi royal family, with their historic ties to Mecca, have considerable traditional legitimacy. What's important to remember is that while institutions have traditional legitimacy, they may be resistant to change. They are not impervious to it. So traditional legitimacy means they've had it before, they have it now. That this is the way we've always done things, and therefore we're going to consider it legitimate. Okay? That we have always done things this way, therefore we're going to continue to do them this way. So it's kind of the status quo. Traditional legitimacy. Many monarchies were suddenly and violently overthrown despite their historical legacy. So it can be overcome, traditional legitimacy. We look at the French Revolution, the Russian monarchy, the Iran's Pahlavi dynasty. These are just a few examples. Traditional legitimacy exists. It is just not nearly as strong as our next two examples. Our next example of legitimacy is charismatic legitimacy. Nelson Mandela, whose life story and personal charm helped unify South Africa, helped many people accept the legitimacy of a post-apartheid state. Another good example of charismatic regimes is Vladimir Putin, whose sometimes shirtless efforts in charismatic legitimacy creation have created plenty of internet memes that you may already be familiar with. Another regime that relies on charismatic legitimacy has been the Il dynasty of North Korea. North Korea is an interesting case since now that Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un, has taken over following his father's death. Many outside analysts wonder whether the younger Kim will have the personal charisma and the political skills necessary to keep control of the political party. But what we're seeing here is kind of almost a personality that people are going to be able to hold on to power because of their charisma, because they are strong, because they have that personality to kind of wield power. We look at Adolf Hitler. We look at Mussolini, how they rose to power because they were able to grab the people with their words and with their actions, and people followed them. Potential weakness of this type of legitimacy is that it commonly dies with the individual who possesses it. It can't withstand all people after people after people. Where a traditional legitimacy, if the queen dies, the power is passed on to the family and it continues to go. With charismatic legitimacy, it dies with the person when they die. Chapter 6 discusses this in a lot more detail, so we're going to look at it later when we get to cults of personality and how they can transform charismatic legitimacy after a leader's death. Our third type of legitimacy is rational legal legitimacy. So people in the United States do not obey the orders from their president because they think he's a great guy. Okay? They do it because he followed the legal procedures set out for people to become president, winning an election. Most Americans believe that elections are a fundamentally proper way to choose a leader, and therefore, even if it's somebody that they disagree with, they are likely to follow the rules because of the way that the person gained the power. It is not through traditional, it is not through charisma, it is because the people chose that person. So under rational legal legitimacy, it is not the individual leaders who are important, or even the values or ideas that they possess, but the office they hold. And once they lose office, they lose most of that authority. We look at Barack Obama today. If he were to tell people, this is the law that you should follow, it doesn't hold a lot of weight because he is no longer the president. No matter how charismatic or how powerful a U.S. president is, once the president leaves office, the public no longer looks to him to make their laws. So the point of this section is that sometimes power is divided by geography. Consider the first case where the state is unitary. And if you need a refresher on what a unitary system of government is, I have linked that below, so you can go ahead and check out what a unitary system is. It's a quick 60-second video for my US AP kids, but it applies here as well. So in a unitary system, there is one national government issuing commands and enjoying consent. Okay? In these states, local authorities have very little power. The United Kingdom, France, Japan, China, these are unitary states. In contrast, federalism is a system where significant state powers, taxation, lawmaking, security, these are devolved to regional or local bodies. In the United States, for instance, education is a policy tradition traditionally given to the states, to individual states to control, not to the federal government. Germany, India, Canada, Russia, these are famous examples of federal states. Russia is problematic as recent changes have given the president more power to dismiss and appoint regional governments. As a result, Russia may not truly be federal, and we're going to talk about them when we get to the case studies in the second half of this course. The United Arab Emirates is a federal system, but it is not a democracy. And so do not mix up federal automatically means democracy. In the United Arab Emirates, 7 emirs, which are kind of like princes, they rule their respective states and share the power with a federal government. Recently, there has been a trend for states, even unitary ones, to shift power to the regions. We're seeing this in the United Kingdom and Scotland. We're going to get to that when we talk about the United Kingdom in a few weeks. But this process is known as devolution. And devolution is the transfer of power from the central government, so like in the United States, our federal government, down to the parts, so in America to the states. And it has been viewed as a way to move power closer to the people. And so we're going to study devolution quite a bit in this course in different things, especially when we get to the United Kingdom. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit more about federal systems. Federal systems, power may be divided unevenly, with some regions having greater power or over taxation or language rights than others. These systems are often found in countries with significant ethnic divisions, and we're definitely going to see that in this class. India and Russia, for instance, both have asymmetric federal designs. In Russia, there are over 83 regional units. 46 of them are oblasts with generally lower autonomy, and 21 are republics. There are a number of other subunits as well. Clever students might point out that even the United States has some asymmetric features. The District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, several Pacific territories of the United States do not have regional governments, and they cannot vote for the United States president. The DC can, but Puerto Rico, the Guam, etc., they cannot vote for the United States president, so they do not have those same federal rights. And so we're going to be looking at things along those ways where we have asymmetric rights with the same rights and powers as of other states. So the strength of the state matters for foreign policy because the problems that emerge from state weakness, crime, terrorism, war, have an impact outside the state's borders. Some scholars therefore distinguish between strong states, weak states, and failed states. And so we want to take a look at that real quick. A strong state is a state that is fully able to fulfill their basic tasks, okay? And we looked at a little bit of those: crime, avoiding terrorism, not going to war, having defense in case there is war, etc. Weak states are those that have difficulty fulfilling those states, and failed states are those that are so weak that political order has collapsed, leading to anarchy and massive violence within the state. Now, states around those states, failed states or weak states, have a legitimate concern and oftentimes will intervene. So categorizing states as weak or as strong doesn't really get at the complexity of state power. Capacity is about the power of the state to command resources. For example, the moon landing was expensive and difficult for the United States, but the government was able to marshal its resources to make it happen. Think about some basic tasks that states are expected to carry out. Defense, making and enforcing rules, collecting taxes, managing the economy, promoting education, filling potholes in a road, and so on. Autonomy is the ability of the state to wield power. So capacity is about the power to command resources. Autonomy is the ability to wield power independently of the public. Like sovereignty, it is the ability to act independent of other actors. Autonomy focuses on domestic groups. Extremes of this might be problematic. States with high autonomy may be able to pursue interests regardless of what the public wants, and those who have low autonomy may be effectively captured by special interests. So autonomy is that ability to wield power. Who can wield the power? So if we're in a government that is maybe more authoritarian, the power is really focused, really strong, and they can impose their will on the public. And if we're in a very, very weak state, then the special interests, and we get some corruption. We're going to see this especially when we get to Nigeria, and you can usually see it on the back wall. There's a corruption chart back there, but we're going to see that the special interests are the ones who really control. The government really has a lack of control. So autonomy is that ability to wield power within the state. But don't forget about capacity. Capacity, can they muster up the resources in order to do the things that they need to do? Okay, do they have the army? Do they have the money to do stuff? Those are the kind of things that we want to compare with capacity and autonomy. And these do not always speak to whether a state is strong or weak. Okay. So we want to make sure that we are focusing on exactly what we're looking at when we're looking at things, okay? We don't want to always be meshing things together. Yes, they do often come together, but not always. And so we want to be careful of that. We want to look at each thing individually and not always assuming that one thing is causing another. Okay, so let's sum this chapter up a little bit. We have 5 big concepts that we want to be able to tackle. First, the state is highly institutionalized political organization possessing sovereignty, and that power in the state is shaped by regimes and governments. Okay. Number 2, the modern state evolved in the highly competitive anarchic system of Europe. 3, states rely on different types of legitimacy in order to maintain stability. And 4, states differ in how power is dispersed between the national and regional governments. And 5, the strength or weaknesses of a state is better measured by considering the state's capacity and autonomy, not capacity or autonomy. My friends, I hope you have a wonderful day. I'll get this posted as soon as I can, and I cannot wait to see you guys in class on Tuesday. Quiz this week. We're going to rock it. Remember, it is us versus the test, and we are going to take that test down. Everybody, 3, 4, or 5. Let's do 4s and 5s. Scry chat. Let's do 5s. We'll see you next time, my friend.